So you must be excited. I saw recently the Steelers are going to host the draft, whatever that means.
I'm not. I guess it's a good thing for Pittsburgh because you get a lot of people coming to town.
Right.
Make some money. But I'm not a big draft Nick, and where they hold it doesn't matter to me at all.
Well, Detroit just had a very successful hosting of it. It was good for the city and all that stuff because, I get all those people in town. So maybe for the city.
Detroit's not used to winning anything.
Well, they did just come off an NFC championship run.
That's what I mean.
Which they now have more than the Cowboys, just to saying. But
the best stat was last night when they showed trips to years since trip to the conference final, and they showed the Rangers and the Mavs and the Lightning, and then the Cowboys 28.
Oops. Well, all right.
Doing great in Dallas.
Yeah, Dallas. I'm glad I'm not a Dallas sports fan. We'll just say that. Go Celtics.
Don't understand how anyone is a Dallas sports fan, but that's life.
Well, all right. Should we talk about what we actually came here to talk about?
I suppose, yes.
Yeah. I'll do the introduction now. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, warning signs for the economy, the BioSecure Act's proposed China decoupling, and more tariffs on the horizon. Joining us to discuss all of this is AAF's Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, in the 6 years I've worked for you, and
you work for me?
Yeah, I know. Wow. Weird to believe. And based off of your recent dishes, I know there's a lot of hot button issues with a lot on your mind, but if you could narrow it down to just one for us and tell us what's on your mind.
I guess my current peeve, shall we call it, is the Biden administration releasing 1 million barrels of gasoline from the Northeast Reserve just to manage the price of gas around the Memorial Day holiday. That is not the purpose of those reserves. They are there for emergencies, not political expediencies, and they've abused the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and this is another example of the abuse of those reserves. I find it indefensible.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it's just a election year policy proposal. Look, I'm doing something.
I wish they would just use cash. I mean, they're trying to buy the election. I get it. This feels like 1912 or something like that. Yeah. Just walk around with a pile of hundreds and get the votes.
One for you, one for you.
No, seriously. I mean, student loans, gasoline, anything they can lay their hands on. Here, would you like a CHIPS Act factory? Mm-hmm. Here you go. So,
I saw that recently. Like they're really touting up Wisconsin. We're not talking about CHIPS Act today, but they're touting up the Wisconsin and Arizona chip things. But anyway,
everyone does this to some degree.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's new and it's not unique for them, but the blatantness of it.
But I mean, going back to the petroleum reserves, this isn't really going to solve the issues of higher gas prices at the pump or, lower energy costs as we head into summer. I mean,
no,
it doesn't do any of that. Well, that's interesting. I had 4-to-1 odds that student loans was going to be on top of your mind.
That's why I went for the.
So I lost that bet. All right. Well, we'll have to do another podcast later down the road on student loans. So let's move on to the economy. There's a lot going on there. Yep. We're starting to see real warning signs on the household sector specifically. I think there was a couple of reports last week where real wages and consumer sentiment have fallen.
Yes.
What do you make of all this recent data?
Both surprising and not, but certainly a concern. So, go back to where I was at least at the end of 2023. The concern was the business sector. Business fixed investment was relatively weak. We go through the first quarter, and the business sector picks up. So we got a solid GDP report that showed real private final demand, households and businesses growing at a 3.1% rate. That's great. So that's January, February, March. And the household sector still looks like the wheels come off in April. We get this terrible report on credit card usage, drops by, growth is down 50%, and that just don't see that happen very often. Retail sales dead flat in the water. Consumer sentiment, huge drop, 10 points in the current conditions index. Now we got earlier this week a really bad existing home sales at the peak selling season. This is it. That's surprising in how quickly it seems to have developed. It's unsurprising in that high interest rates are taking their toll.
Yeah.
That was the point, and the Fed has been trying to accomplish this.
Yeah, it's interesting we didn't see more of a taper off kind of effect. I mean, because for so long we've talked about the reason the economy hasn't gone down fast into a recession was because people were willing to spend money still.
Yep. And there's a narrative. I haven't seen data that I personally can attest to this, but there's a narrative out there that we've got essentially high income versus low income households, and this is the low income households really getting feeling the brunt of the high interest rates and the slowing economy. So worth keeping an eye on. There are two reasons for the Fed to cut. Preemptively for a soft landing, or because something's really wrong.
Right.
And they're going to be watching this carefully.
Yeah, so maybe I was going to ask you in the context of the Fed looking at all this with interest rates, and we know we have the June meeting coming up, and then August, I think, September is the one after. I can't remember the calendar.
They'll have an August meeting.
Yeah. So I mean, they're looking at all. How are they looking at all this? I mean, in terms of the interest rate stuff.
We got the minutes of the most recent Fed meeting, and there's just a lot of angst in the room about the sustained high inflation. This was the day before we got the CPI report that showed finally, after 3 bad months, a relatively soft month. But there was various participants were willing to contemplate raising rates if conditions required it. Sort of a pretty hawkish tone coming out of the Fed. Get a soft inflation report, some weak reports on the real economy, then who knows?
Right.
But I will say, this hasn't shown up yet in the labor market. We had this 1 week where UI claims jumped 22,000. I was like, oh, that makes me nervous. Next week they were flat. We just got those again today. They were down modestly, 5,000 on fewer claims. So there's no evidence of the kind of recession slowdown where there are a lot of layoffs.
Yeah, I know there's a few economists out there saying we might be already in one.
Yeah.
There's, that argument's already happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the right way to think about it is for a couple of years, the Fed had the luxury of having a single mandate. Fight inflation,
right?
And you solve the problem. Now it's back to being a dual mandate Fed. Fight inflation, but not at the expense of too much employment growth.
Right.
So they're going to have to make some hard calls.
Yeah. In the context of a presidential election happening in the background, I do not envy their position at all.
No. This is a year they earned their money. Last year, maybe not.
All right. So yeah, I mean. We'll probably continue talking about the economy. We'll have to continue to watch it. We'll get more data. We'll hope. I know you mentioned the CPI report came in a little lower. We'll see if that trend continues.
We get the PCE next week.
PCE next week. Which one is the Fed's preferred?
The PCE.
The PCE. So that's the one to really watch.
Yeah.
Because I know last week we also had the PPI, and that was a little hotter than expected, but that was the day before the CPI, so kind of was a.
It's not central to the debate. It's informative of the other indices. So it looks like, some things came in hotter early in the year, and now we're going to have the luxury of turning into economic historians and looking back and trying to figure out what was going on.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, we'll have to watch for that PC video from you next week, I guess.
Yes.
Stay tuned. Let's talk about a bill that's making its way through Congress, the BioSecure Act. AAF has a forthcoming insight on the issue, on the bill itself. So just to start with, for those who are not familiar with the bill, including myself,
sure.
What does it do?
So first of all, there are many bills in Congress. We don't write on all of them. The reason we chose to focus on this is it looks like it's one of the few pieces of legislation that could happen in an election year, because there is a unified concern over China.
Yes.
And the starting point for this legislation is the discovery that some of the Chinese biopharma companies had leaked genetic information to the Communist Party, American genetic information. So lawmakers okay, we need to sever ties. Started out with those companies, sort of by name. There were 4 companies. And then as the legislation evolved, it was, we're just going to cut ties with the Chinese biopharma industry. That sounded great until you start doing the math about just how much we rely on the Chinese biopharma industry. And in some market segments, like one company makes half the products, and overall they're responsible for 23% of our imports. And So you can't just say forget it. You're going to have to phase that in. And so at this point, it's sort of no new contracts. Existing contracts have to be ended by 2032. So give yourself a pretty long ramp to get out. Then there's the question, where do you go next? And the quote obvious answer is India, large, has lots of facilities, makes a lot of drugs, big source of generic drugs in the globe. Recently, however, the FDA has inspected some facilities in India and, failed the inspections, all sorts of concerns about the quality and reliability of their production processes. So maybe that's not the solution. So the BioSecure Act is beautifully named because the whole idea is to cut ties with China and become secure, but it looks like cutting ties with China does not produce security. It produces where are we going to go next.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's a good idea on paper, but there's all these logistical problems that you have to figure out.
And this is just a reminder that whatever one might think about China, the notion that the U.S. is going to quickly and economically easily decouple is just a fiction. These are the two largest economies on the globe. They are intricately intertwined. And figuring out what the strategic places are to put up some security provisions is a better way to think about it than we're just not going to do business with it.
Yeah. So I mean, speaking of the economics of all this, I mean, from a pure marketplace economics standpoint, what does this mean for the pharmaceutical drug making industry?
Drugs are going to be more expensive,
and for patients.
I mean, in the end, if we pretended just for a second, it's not actually true, but if we pretended just for a second that these patterns reflect a genuine comparative advantage, we are moving away from the place that has the comparative advantage in the production of a lot of drugs. That means we're going to put them someplace that doesn't have it, where it's going to be more expensive, and that's bad news from a sort of patient or health sector point of view.
Yeah, because we're already dealing with a lot of high drug prices, and we've already have proposals and legislations to lower it. So this just makes it I can't imagine makes it a little harder.
And for the economists who love to bang the drum forever, it is just a reminder that the questions are never absolute. They're relative, and there are always these trade-offs. How much do we want to do something? Is it worth it?
Yeah.
And this is a classic example.
Interesting. All right, let's do your favorite part of the podcast, trivia section.
Yes, let's do that.
All right, the EPA estimates that its two new rules on emission standards and greenhouse gas reporting for petroleum and natural gas systems will involve roughly X billion in total additional costs for affected industries.
Oh man, this is one I don't know. Okay, let's think.
It's in today's dish.
Okay, well, I haven't read today's dish yet because I've been busy working.
Oh, all right.
All right.
I read every word that you put in that dish.
I don't. Okay, let me think. Greenhouse gas, petroleum facilities. We're looking at $18 billion in costs.
It's a little lower, 2.4.
Oh wow!
According to Dan Goldbeck's research, but.
Well, Dan would know.
And that was today's fact of the day. But I mean, it does highlight that. I mean. Dan was on the Hill yesterday talking to Congress about this, that we're dealing with some pretty high regulatory impacts here.
It's extraordinarily high. And, he was talking to the Small Business Committee because, in principle, every agency is supposed to check with the small business community if there's going to be a disproportionate impact of a rulemaking on them. It appears no checking is going on. And so the discussion was what's going to happen out there. And it's just hard to imagine that having imposed over $1.6 trillion in regulatory costs, there isn't some downstream fallout on the business sector.
Yeah, I mean, large businesses, it does affect them, but they might have the resources to deal with some of these regulatory costs. I think I heard from the hearing yesterday that some people spend upwards of half of their day dealing with some of these small businesses. Like that's an insane.
Well, we're a small business.
Yes.
You've walked into our kitchen and seen all the notices that are basically regulations on things that we're supposed to do and give you access to and warn you about. Like, I'm not supposed to be stealing your wages, so no wage theft. I won't do that, I promise. There is a real compliance cost there. Yeah, no question.
And then the other thing that I think Dan said it in the hearing that to this point in each individual administration, the Biden administration is 5 times ahead of where the Obama administration was. And to put that into context, the Obama administration was dealing with Dodd-Frank and ACA regulations at the time.
Absolutely, yes.
So
I mean,
that's stunning. That's astonishing.
It is stunning. It really is. And yes, it's in part because of the climate agenda, some of the rulemaking, like the tailpipe rule, that essentially forces people to drive electric vehicles, are super expensive, and but it's across the board. It really is. The labor regs are there.
Yeah.
You know, you look at one of the most expensive is in Treasury, so tracking the so-called beneficial ownership rule, where you have to reveal who's actually behind different corporations, and the paperwork involved is enormous, and the tracking is enormous, and everywhere you look.
Interesting. Well, let's end today with some talk about tariffs. This continuously is going to come up during the election, and we got a new proposal, President Biden announced a sharp increase in tariffs on China's EV, solar panels, and battery technologies. We've discussed at length the problems of tariffs here at AAF, but I think it bears repeating. Walk us through the problems here.
So the tariffs are going to be 100%, say, on Chinese EVs. We don't really import Chinese EVs right now. The existing tariffs on Chinese products are enough to stop that. So there's one line of reasoning that you'll hear, which is that, well, this doesn't do anything. It's politically posturing. It's empty, something like that. That's just not true, because there's now a tariff wall that's much higher that protects domestic producers, and they can raise their prices up to the point where that tariff wall gets exceeded. So this is just upward pressure on the price of EVs, which makes meeting the climate goals much more expensive. And that same will be true for solar panels. Same will be true for all of the components with these tariffs on them. So they did their best to minimize the cost by choosing 18 billion in imports to be the ones that they put the tariffs on. It's not a huge swath, but there's nothing about this that doesn't make their climate agenda more expensive. And they continually make their climate agenda more expensive, to the enormous frustration of the sort of green lobby out there. I mean, we're starting to see increasing commentary on this. But politics trumps the climate. We're going to release the gas from the reserve. Talked about that. We're going to protect, in particular, union workers in auto plants and supply chains in swing states in the Midwest. That's what this is about.
Yep. I mean, my final question was going to be, does this threaten their climate agenda? I mean, it just seems like we had this whole lead up to we're going to be the most green administration, and then now, the tariffs and all of this just seems to just throw that out the window.
There are a million places where this comes up. So, take the tax credits for investing in wind turbines, say, like big tax credits. You don't get them unless the wind turbine is made out of steel made in the United States. So we don't make the electric steel that they make wind turbines out of. So we can't actually get anyone to qualify for those credits. So that, but we could if we let Nippon buy U.S. steel, but we're not going to let Nippon buy U.S. steel. So they just get twisted into knots over this stuff, and they make the agenda much more expensive.
Interesting. Well, Doug, thanks for joining us and breaking this all down. I'm sure we'll have a lot more of these conversations going forward as we head into the election season.
No doubt.